We want to thank everybody for attending today and want to start on time. We'll start with introducing Evelyn, who's the principal investigator for the Kansas Disaster Outreach Grant that is funding today's webinar. Evelyn, welcome to Monday morning, and welcome to everyone else.
Good morning, good Monday morning to everyone. It's great to see you all online. We're excited about today's presentation and so glad you could join us. So I'll just start. Oh, sorry. So I'm just going to start off with some house cleaning parts for today, just to cue us up for the wonderful presentation that we'll hear in just a minute. So today's presentation is going to look at early interventions for disaster-affected youth and families. And this work is supported through a Kansas Disaster Outreach grant that has been received through SAMHSA. Just to take a few reminders, I know it's nice to see some returning faces who I know have attended many echoes, and then also some new faces. So just a few reminders that the session's being recorded and we'll share it with you afterwards. Your microphones have been muted, but we really welcome your comments. So please unmute or use the chat to talk. You can test out the chat by typing in your name and organization, just so we know who's here and on the call. We appreciate you keeping your camera on so it feels like we're talking to people instead of blank screens. So if you're able to do that, that's wonderful. Your completion certificates will be emailed. So it's really important that you share your name in the chat so that we can make sure that we are able to send you the certificate after the session. So with no further ado, I know we have a lot of wonderful material to cover today. Let's get started. So we're really fortunate to have three child and family advocates to speak with us today. I'm really fortunate to work with all three on our Kansas Disaster Outreach Program. They really each has a unique niche around helping children and families. So I'm excited to have them present today. All three are assistant professors. Joa Williams and Erin Hambrick are assistant professors and psychologists at University of Missouri, Kansas City. And then Dr. Melissa Maris is a psychologist and assistant professor at University of Missouri. In addition, Dr. Maris brings particular expertise in working with school districts and rural school districts around trauma. Dr. Williams brings a particular expertise in skills for psychological recovery. And then Dr. Hambrick brings expertise around psychological first aid. And she also is the lead for the Child Trauma Academy. So with no further ado, let's hand it off to Melissa and get rolling with the presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Evelyn, and good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We are so excited to be here today to talk to you about early intervention with young people and their families after a disaster. And can we go to the next slide, Christy, please? Just a couple other things before we launch into this. Some more housekeeping kind of checkbox things, some project disclosures in terms of our financial relationships. And we're not planning to discuss an unapproved or investigative use of a commercial product. And then also on the next slide, in terms of mitigating potential bias, we are planning to talk about recommendations and really the evidence around disaster response that is best practice of what we currently know and what is currently accepted. And then finally, after our webinar today, we are going to follow up to get a little bit more feedback from you all about today's training. We would appreciate it if you complete that survey. These data are helpful for us in terms of our ongoing improvement and planning, also to get funding to fund things like this webinar. And the presentation materials will be sent with you along with the chat log. And so our team will be sharing links in the chat. Certainly, as Evelyn said, please, if you have questions, post them in the chat, and we will try to keep up with that. But speaking of surveys, we thought it would be helpful to start off today talking a little bit about who we might have on the call today. So it looks like right now we're at about 71 folks who are here with us this morning. Again, welcome. But in terms of prior experience working with children, this is what you all told us in the survey that you all completed with registration. So in terms of, I have prior experience working with children and families in the early aftermath of disaster exposure. These were your responses. So if you look at the blue in the pie chart, these are the agree and strongly agree. You can see that about a third, a little bit more than a third of our group. Can you all hear me now? Okay. About 30% agree, strongly agree. We had about that same number, so about a third who disagreed or strongly disagreed. But again, about a third who said neither agree or disagree, which is interesting. So we're thinking about prior experience working with children and families in the early aftermath of disaster exposure, that even talking about what that means might be helpful. So we're actually going to start off today talking a little bit about trauma, the foundation, kind of how we define that. And then Joa and Aaron will talk to us more specifically about PFA and SPR. So we thought we would start today in terms of kind of having a little bit of interaction. When we think about disaster and trauma, heavy on a Monday morning, absolutely. But certainly after this past year and with COVID, we have all now experienced something really difficult. And when something like this happens, we want to acknowledge the negative, but also we see an opportunity for thinking about and considering what folks are now terming post-traumatic growth. So Christy, if you want to go to the next slide. So we were thinking that we would start off this morning with a word cloud. So this is interactive, and Christy's going to share the link with you here in a second. But really thinking about what unexpected growth or positive change might result from a disaster. Things out of our control, we wish a lot of times they didn't happen, but they do. But what are some positive things that might happen as a result of a disaster? So if you follow the link that Christy is posting in the chat, it'll prompt you to enter in a word. So a single word. If you have a couple of words that you want to put in, make sure you link them together. And then essentially we'll share what everybody presents. So go ahead and go to that word cloud and share kind of one word that might describe unexpected growth or positive change that might result from a disaster. So I'm seeing some friends share in the chat here. So hope, closer to family. If you all follow that link that Christy posted, it'll actually come up and it's going to be on the screen. So that then we can see all those words together, and we can see which words come up the most, and sort of what that impact is there. This is kind of a cool new toy that we've been playing with webinars and echoes. Oh, I'm excited. I can see some of the words popping up. I think I may have seen cooking. I don't know if anybody else has been cooking a lot. I did right at the beginning of COVID, quite a lot of cooking when things were scarce. So if you haven't yet, head to that word cloud and type in your word. And if you haven't had the opportunity to check in the chat, if you can just share your name and your organization, that would be super helpful. And here in a minute, we will check out the words that folks shared in our word cloud.
And Christy, I just want to make sure you know we're not seeing the word cloud yet.
Thanks, Robert.
Okay, I will get that up just 1 second.
Thanks, everybody. It's Monday.
Are we seeing it now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right. So let's see what you all shared in here. So it looks like big words that popped up. There's the cooking that I saw, hope, closeness, family, resiliency. I see resilience a few times in here in different formats. Closer to family, self-confidence, time to bond with family. Absolutely, that's one that I hear a lot. Other ones, building on strengths, new relationships, appreciation and gratitude, rest. So a lot of togetherness, empathy. That's, I think, a new one. Creativity, unity. So again, this idea, and I think I've certainly been seeing this in the news lately, and even research that's coming out around post-traumatic growth, that when we talk about this, it's hard because we don't want to try to, force optimism or try to put a silver lining on something that's a challenge. And clearly there have been a lot of, challenge isn't even the right word, right? It's been really, really, really difficult. But what we have seen in the research shows this, that after a disaster, after something really difficult, that a number of people and communities actually do show what we would call post-traumatic growth. So changes, and folks look back and just describe that event in the situation with these kinds of words. So again, some things that are not in our control, but hopefully we can figure out ways, and what we're going to talk about today in terms of trauma, and especially in the early intervention, the immediate sort of response to a disaster can hopefully increase the likelihood of these kinds of outcomes versus some of the negative outcomes that we know are typically associated with trauma and other kinds of disasters. So Christy, if it's okay, if we can go back to the presentation and kind of head to the next slide. And thank you so much. So as we talk about trauma and difficult things here, this is kind of your self-care pause here. Just a reminder, this is difficult and difficult content. As I shared earlier, we have all been through difficult things in this last year, different kinds of difficult things. This was one self-care sort of toolkit that I saw recently. It was featured on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and Erin is going to talk a little bit more about that, and we'll share the link here in the chat. But this Pause, Reset, Nourish out of the Hamilton Health Sciences, and it's just a good adult self-care resilience kind of site. What I really like about the actual Hamilton Health Sciences site, which is going to be that first link to the toolkit, is there's a number of tools in there that are very much kind of what I would call plug and play. So they've already formatted it. It's a one-page PDF. It's something that could be printed off and posted somewhere. So it's easy to use, very, very easy to use. Some really good short videos. But I really liked this start of the day resilience checklist. They have another one for the end of the day. But again, this idea, and we know this, and you all know this too, but self-care resilience really comes from practicing these kinds of things and doing it on a daily basis and really making it a habit. So just wanted to encourage all of us to do this on a Monday morning as we talk about difficult content, but certainly we appreciate anything you need to do to take care of yourself during this webinar. We can go to the next slide. So trauma. How do we define trauma? So we like the SAMHSA definition. There are a number of different definitions of trauma out there, but I like the 3 E's mostly because it's easy to remember. So individual trauma results from an event. So that's the first E. Series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced. That's the second E. As physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So there's an event, it's experienced, and then it has these negative effects. So it's easy to remember, but also the simplicity, I think, kind of disguises the complexity, because I think one other thing I like about this definition is that it really shows how individualized trauma can be. We always talk about how trauma is trauma is trauma. Nobody's trauma is bigger than anybody else's trauma. And that really does come down to these 3 E's, that individuals experience events in very different ways and that they can have these different kinds of effects. So there are some links to some other resources here, but we did want to acknowledge that trauma has become a concept and a word that's used a lot. And so we're not going to delve into kind of the details of sort of where is there a line of trauma and where is there not a line. Again, trauma is trauma is trauma, looking at those effects, but that there are differences, right? And so when we think about, in particular with disasters, with something like COVID, we can start using words like mass trauma or, community trauma, public or shared trauma. So these are the kinds of things that happen that are out in the open. It's public, and so people can see it, versus a private trauma, which might happen to one individual. Child sexual abuse would be an example of a private trauma typically. But then this idea of a collective or shared trauma, something that's happening to a community. So we think about a disaster, we think about COVID, that would be something that is known, it's out there, it's something that is happening across a lot of different people. Next slide, please, Christy. But also this idea that when we're talking about trauma, we need to acknowledge that trauma is trauma is trauma, but not everybody's trauma is the same, and that trauma is shifting a lot, right? And so I remember early on in COVID, I heard this metaphor about boats in a storm, and this idea that we're all together in this really large body of water, right? And we're all in the water, and there's a storm, right? But we're all in different kinds of boats. And the storm might be different at different times for different people. And so when we're thinking about trauma and the impact of trauma, and particularly compounding trauma, right? So if someone has COVID and then, maybe they have a first responder in the family, maybe they've had a loss, maybe they bring with them their backpack of different kinds of privilege or not, or resources or not. And so that all of those things become a part of this. So that we might all be in the storm, but that we're all in different boats. And so that we're all going to experience this a little bit different. And so we say this to say, we can't simplify it. We're not going to unpack it a lot today, but the trauma is there, and we should recognize, and always want to try to recognize the different levels of this that people are bringing with their shared experiences, with their lived experiences to this conversation, and that it's different, and that it seems to kind of come and go in ways. It's hard at different times for different people for different reasons. We've certainly seen that with COVID, right? And we can anticipate that happening. The same goes for any kind of this shared collective natural disaster. It is something we have in common, but in fact, we have experienced it very differently, and have experienced it differently along a number of lines. And so it's both to talk and recognize the shared collective part of it, but also the distinct and individual part. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to my colleague, Joa, who I think is going to get us started with maybe another word cloud. So Joa.
Hi, thanks, Melissa. And good morning, everyone. So happy Monday. And again, my name's Joel Williams, just to virtually introduce myself to all of you, and really happy that you all joined us this morning, so thank you. And one of the things that I think is good to sort of ask ourselves at this point in the presentation is thinking about ways that we all can, under certain circumstances, grow following extreme stress, disasters, and potentially traumatic events. I also want us to think for a moment about some of the unique challenges that we face, because certainly as providers, as frontline providers, we're all working with families who are encountering a number of very real and significant challenges in the face of disaster and trauma. So let me ask this question then, and we'll similarly do another word cloud activity based on your responses to this. But what are some of the greatest short-term challenges that either you've seen personally or in your work facing youth and families after trauma and other kinds of disasters? So I'll turn that over, and maybe if we could post that link in the chat, we'll see what folks say there.
I hope everyone will go out and click on the link and
Fear, yeah. Absolutely. And meaning making, and I'm glad someone said meaning making, because as other folks continue to add words here, I think meaning making in and of itself, while incredibly important for our long-term recovery, can also be a very difficult process for us to walk through too, right? That can be a real challenge, the process of trying to make meaning. So I appreciate someone saying that. Yeah, communication can be a real challenge. Absolutely, yes. Trying to establish equilibrium, normalcy, right? Resources, finding a new normal, yeah. Loss, and loss I think is extremely important, right? Because certainly as folks keep kind of adding some things here, Melissa was talking about just some of the unique qualities about what makes a traumatic event traumatic, right? And what makes a disaster what it is. Certainly in many cases of experiences where we talk about trauma and where we talk about disasters, a lot of these kinds of experiences involve some threat to ourselves or someone else we love, but in many circumstances, it can also mean that we end up losing someone that we love as well, right? Or we end up losing important things or people in our lives, right? Or end up losing places that are important to us. So loss is often a very real, but sometimes overlooked facet of trauma, certainly. Yeah. So uncertainty, right? So financial stress, insecurity. So this is, I mean, I think everyone here has really touched on some of the most important pieces for us to take away at this point in our webinar this morning, because you've clearly identified some of the very real challenges that folks will often face, from very pragmatic concerns about where am I going to get my next meal, to shelter, to disruptions in financial stability, all of which can be in an instant completely affected by traumatic event or a disaster, right? And certainly in cases of ongoing trauma, or where we're talking about community level trauma or mass disasters. But there's also the emotional toll that it takes, the fear, the sadness that comes with loss, the despair that comes with loss, right? So I think everyone is sort of noting here the important truth about what happens in the wake of trauma for many of us, right, is that while meaning making and growth can occur, there are also some very real short-term challenges that can sometimes become long-term challenges that we all have a role in addressing. So, and I think it's important to ask ourselves about some of the kinds of challenges that you've all just highlighted and mentioned here, because at each point along the way, no matter who you are and what we do, we all need to be mindful of these challenges to better understand how to help families and kids begin moving towards recovery and growth and resilience after a trauma or a disaster. And I think that's especially true when we start thinking about what we can all do on the front lines in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, when we start thinking about early intervention and what we mean by early intervention. So absolutely, I appreciate all this. Let's see if we can pull our slides up. We'll talk a little bit about what we mean by early intervention. Okay. So when we think about early intervention, right, what do we mean? We're really talking about interventions, and Erin and I are going to give you some examples of what those look like, but we're talking about ways of trying to sit with kids and families in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event or some other kind of disaster, right? With the goal of trying to help reduce immediate distress and mitigate risk factors for chronic psychological problems, okay? So what do I mean by that? When Melissa talked to us a little bit about trauma and disaster, right? We talked about the range of reactions that folks can have to trauma and how each of us kind of responds in a very individual way. And while most of us will ultimately recover or eventually recover from exposure to a trauma or a traumatic event, that's not always true, right? There are a number of complications, and in particular, mental health complications that we have to be mindful of, including post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, prolonged or complicated grief, other kinds of anxiety, right? If we're talking about older adolescents, adult substance use can sometimes be significant concerns. So there are some unique complications that for a subset of folks can persist and can continue over time. And in general, we can think about treating those kinds of things with established mental health treatments and psychotherapies, right? And behavioral health clinics, and we can refer folks to care there. But most folks never actually get into care, right? And that's one of the things that's a real challenge for us as psychologists and as mental health providers. But many, many more people will reach out to others in their immediate communities and their immediate support networks for help in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, right? Reach out to each and every one of us, right? And they're more likely to do that in the first few days and weeks after a trauma or a disaster happens. So with early intervention, we can really, I think, have a much bigger reach and a much bigger impact than we will if we just wait for folks to come in if those complications persist, right? So with early intervention, what we're trying to do is think about how we reduce distress and, again, mitigate risk factors for some of those chronic psychological problems that I talked about. And the kinds of risk factors that we know are sort of, have been documented in research that suggests that, hey, these things together can really increase risk for these chronic psychological problems are many of the things that you all have already pointed out when we did the last word cloud activity. So resource loss, right? If I lose, if I lose financial stability, if I can't go to school anymore, right? Or I suddenly have to change schools, if we're talking about isolation and withdrawal from other people, including family or others in your community, intense emotional distress, guilt or blaming yourself over having not been able to stop something or wishing that you could have, or that somebody else, that you could have taken better care of someone else, right? All those kinds of things can really increase risk for more chronic kinds of problems. And with early intervention, these are the kind of things that we're going to address. And so if we can flip to the next slide, I'll just show you sort of one more visual here that I think really kind of highlights to you what we mean by early intervention and where it fits kind of on the continuum of care for trauma survivors, for both kids, families, and adults. Because when we talk about the continuum of care, early intervention is really kind of these pieces that you see at the bottom of the pyramid here, right? We're really talking about designing interventions that are primary prevention efforts and secondary prevention efforts. And these are what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the webinar today. And then also kind of doing some more in-depth training on, and some echoes that we'll talk about and offer a little bit later on here in the next few weeks. But just so folks are kind of aware, these all have an important place in the continuum of care for trauma survivors. So when we talk about primary prevention, we're just talking about ways that we can help work with kids and families, regardless of who they are and regardless of what the circumstances might be. And these are things that people are generally going to benefit from in the first 24 to 72 hours after a trauma happens. So really fast, right? These are really quick interventions that we try to roll out and get to folks as quickly as possible, and include things like psychological first aid, which Aaron's going to talk a little bit about here next. But while early intervention in the form of psychological first aid can certainly be useful for folks, sometimes people will continue to have significant concerns or distress in the weeks, that follow, in the days and weeks that follow. So for those folks, we might start to do more secondary prevention efforts. And these are sort of more targeted kinds of early interventions for folks who are continuing to have elevated symptoms or ongoing concerns in the weeks and months post-disaster. Of course, for folks who then go on to develop more chronic sort of complications and psychiatric conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, right? We refer folks up for tertiary prevention or for mental health treatment, right? But these two pieces at the bottom, I think, are really important for us. And we're going to talk about sort of what these early intervention efforts look like and how you can start to learn more about them and integrate them into your efforts and the work that you do in your own communities. So Aaron, I'll turn it over to you. We'll talk a little bit about this first one, these primary prevention efforts in psychological first aid.
Yes, thanks for that introduction, Joa. I really love talking about and teaching about psychological first aid because psychological first aid is really meant to be delivered and used, just like Joa said, in the very first hours, days, and couple of weeks after someone has experienced a disaster. Shared disaster, or it could be, a personal trauma, but psychological first aid was developed with the intent to be rolled out in kind of these disaster and shared trauma settings. So lots of the examples we talk about do end up being disaster focused. One thing I like about psychological first aid is that it can and actually should be provided by any response worker. So this is not limited to mental health providers. And in fact, as a mental health provider, as a psychologist, sometimes I like to say that people who don't have mental health backgrounds are sometimes more natural at providing psychological first aid, because psychological first aid as an early intervention is meant to get people on the right path in the hopes of preventing long-term mental health problems. But it is not a mental health intervention per se. It is an intervention that's very focused on the present moment, that's very focused about basic connection with individuals whose lives have just been changed in dramatic ways, and connecting with people whose stress response systems are probably very activated because of what just happened to them. So it's meant to be provided by any response provider: Red Cross, police force, fire, EMS, people who work in emergency rooms, and teachers, people who are within the schools, individuals who are likely to encounter a disaster affected person within this short time frame. I also really like psychological first aid because it was developed to be flexibly applied. It was developed to be flexibly applied throughout the lifespan. So when you go, down here, we've got the link to the psychological first aid field operations manual. There are great in-depth online trainings in psychological first aid that, for those interested, I would highly recommend.
And Alex Chang just noted that they're free. So
yes, they're totally free. I know. See, this is why I have so much love for psychological first aid, because the knowledge is out there and it really is for the taking. And a little bit of knowledge in psychological first aid is better than none. So it's also one of those things that if you learn a little bit, you can hopefully be more effective than if you didn't know a little bit. It's not one of those things where, gosh, if you haven't gotten the whole thing, then don't get involved. So it's meant to be flexibly applied for people throughout the lifespan. It's also developed to be culturally respectful. When people experience trauma and bad things, there are often really important spiritual and cultural responses that have promoted coping for that person in the past or for that community in the past. And really a big job of providing psychological first aid is to not get in the way of that and to support it. And to help people heal and recover in ways that feel naturally to them, instead of trying to impose a lot of structure on the way that people cope in those immediate moments. Another really big key takeaway about what psychological first aid is that it's meant to promote efficacy, not only within the person, but within the community. So psychological first aid being something that's supposed to be delivered in the early aftermath, it's really not meant for the experts from out of town to come into disaster affected communities and provide it. It's meant to be provided within community by people who understand the community, who know who the key stakeholders are in the community, and who understand some of the cultural nuances of the community. And that is actually a really good way for communities to heal. If a community has been disaster affected, that really takes a lot of the sense of control away from the community. But knowing that there are ways that even you, as a disaster affected person, as a disaster affected community, can have the tools to get yourselves back on the path to recovery can be really empowering and really promotes the best long-term outcomes. One thing I want to say here before I kind of provide an overview of the 8 core actions that comprise psychological first aid is just a little bit of jargon here. I saw that Robert put in the chat here a minute ago. Psychological first aid does differ from mental health first aid. I'm not going to go into the details, but we know that a lot of people in the area receive training in mental health first aid. The two are different, with, again, psychological first aid being focused on this disaster context and the immediate aftermath, and how do we provide practical assistance and engage with disaster affected people in ways that let them know they're not alone and that there are resources that they can rely on. It also differs from critical incidents response debriefing or management, which, again, lots of people in the area have training in. And I would say the biggest difference is that psychological first aid does not contain any guidance or recommendations for group-based debriefing of the traumatic event. All right, so Christy, if you can move us to the next slide. Yes, and Melissa, thank you for saying that about PFA being a great tool for faith-based leaders. There's a psychological first aid manual, like a regular manual, and then there's also one for schools and one for spiritual leaders. So again, kind of that idea that we want people who are already embedded with the community being the ones to provide this important response. So psychological first aid is comprised of 8 core actions. If you are encountering a disaster affected person, say that you're working at a shelter that's been developed in response to a flood where people were displaced from their homes, or say that you are working in a school and you know that children whose neighborhoods were affected by a tornado are going to be coming into the school the next day. There are 8 core actions that you could use. What I like about PFA is everything, as you can already tell, but you don't have to apply these in any order. You can really apply the ones that best fit to a person's needs. So once you have familiarity of all 8, you really have a lot of choice and the ability to say, you know, I think this is needed for this child and this family right now. Now I'm going to go into a little more depth about the safety and comfort core action and the connection with social supports action. But I want to highlight just kind of the broad array here too, so that people can have an understanding of, hey, if I wanted to learn more about this, what would I be learning and getting myself into? So in terms of contact and engagement, what you'll find if you pick up the psychological first aid manual is that the focus is, again, meeting people where they are and not doing anything to confuse or increase stress. So I just happen to be a clinical child psychologist, but if I were working in a shelter and people were coming there because they'd been displaced from their homes, if I were following PFA recommendations, I would make contact with people by saying, hi, I'm Erin. I'm working here at the shelter, and this is my role at the shelter if you need something, right? I actually probably wouldn't say, hi, I'm Dr. Hambrick. I'm a psychologist, right? Because even though those things might be true about me, if you think about kind of the state of a disaster affected person, their stress response system is understandably on alert. They're kind of driven by their senses, really taking in sights and sounds, trying to discern, am I safe or am I not safe? This bad thing just happened. Is something else about to happen? So saying things like, you know, I'm a psychologist might even kind of increase the anxiety. Why is a psychologist coming to help me? Am I already showing signs that something is wrong with me? Right. So really just wanting to let people know basic information. If you're introducing yourself to a child, really being thoughtful. Am I towering over them? Because that can be kind of intimidating, especially in the face of something bad that may have just happened. Or, you know, am I sitting down on a chair? Am I introducing myself, you know, with a bag of crayons or looking very official with a clipboard? So just being very thoughtful about what has just happened to the people I'm encountering and what might be the basic things that are going to help them. Thinking about things like, how do I enhance their sense of safety as quickly as possible? We know from long-term research following disaster survivors that the quicker you biologically feel safe, the quicker we can get your stress response system back to baseline, the better you're going to do long term. So have I done things to let people know, we're watching the weather and there aren't other storm cells coming through, making sure that there isn't too much media on, and I'm kind of skipping ahead, but how are we ensuring that sense of safety? Do we have a mechanism for kind of recognizing signs of extreme acute distress? Maybe labored breathing that could indicate hyperventilation, maybe kind of glossy eyes staring off in the future, people being very withdrawn. Are we recognizing those signs and thinking about ways to stabilize and to help those individuals maybe engage in some very simple breathing or grounding activities to bring them back to the present moment? So again, I could go through all of them. I kind of just introduced those first three because I think those three are really central to kind of that lens of psychological first aid, really trying to figure out in this moment, what are the primary things that people need? The primary thing that they need probably isn't, and to be asked, oh gosh, what happened to you? It must have been so terrible. Don't you want to talk about it? And making comments like that, really what they need is kind of a face of we're safe now and we can all get through this together by taking it really one small step at a time. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So just a couple of things I want to say about safety and comfort. Again, I've kind of already shared the research that would suggest why this is so important to establish in these first moments after disaster. So what are some things that we can do to make people feel safe? Well, I've given examples of, if someone comes into a shelter and they've been displaced. One thing that we can do is, make sure that we don't have TVs on that are constantly showing footage of what's happened, because that could make someone really feel as if they are still experiencing the trauma and will make it very hard for their biology to kind of return to baseline. But to give another example, I've had lots of people reach out, with COVID, this has been an ongoing pandemic, something that each day we're kind of faced with information. And so when people have said, well, what do we do to increase safety and comfort, kind of when the trauma won't go away, it's still ongoing. And some recommendations that I've given to people, especially related to limiting media exposure, which we know is really key to promoting safety, have been to do things like have certain times of day that you check media and make sure you're only checking the media for a specific thing that might help you be as safe as possible that day, right? So maybe each day I want to know how high the COVID numbers are so I can make decisions about where I feel safe having my family go. That's fine. Go on there, do it, and then turn it off. Don't allow yourself to, I think the term was kind of doom scroll that came out during the pandemic, that it was very easy for people to just get hooked into looking and looking and looking on media, and to help your family members do that as well. And to also increase structure and communication. I saw a lot of people say that communication is hard following disaster, but actually increasing structure and schedules and communications within families and within schools and other organizations is really key to promoting a sense of safety. And I think sometimes after something bad happens, we just kind of want to give people a break. And I understand that, but especially for kids, getting them back to routine and structure can really promote a sense of safety immediately. And not feeling bad about that, knowing there's research behind this is good, let's get them back to the routine, and through that they will find ways to begin to cope. Go on to the next and final slide for me. But very related to promoting a sense of safety, actually one way that we do promote a sense of safety is increasing connection and access to social supports. So research has also showed that when something bad happens, if we are near or next to or connected to someone that we trust and care about, the impact of that event on us is typically less. And the same is true for if we are able to access people who are meaningful to us in that immediate aftermath. I think something that's important about this is it seems so basic, and actually so much of PFA seems so basic, but really it's about thinking about doing this in the moment, because there's a lot of chaos and upheaval that sometimes it doesn't strike people. I really would feel better if I had a minute to connect via Zoom or FaceTime with someone far away, or if someone just came and sat with me. And again, not a lot of focus on talking, but a focus on presence and connection, and in a way that actually does feel safe. So being careful not to presume that when we say connecting with social supports is good, that means giving kids that maybe you don't know that well really big hugs, because maybe they don't want a hug and that makes them feel worse. But just thinking about the basics of connection. Have I introduced myself? Have I made myself available? And am I in enough proximity to promote safety while also respecting a person's needed boundaries during this time? So that's all I'll say about PFA for now, but I do hope we plan to do some additional trainings related to psychological first aid, and I hope that many of you will choose to join us. I think back to you, Joa.
All right, thank you, Erin, for the overview of PFA. And so we're going to do, well, I guess are we going to skip over our Zoom poll right now?
Yeah, I kind of forgot about that. Do we think, so yeah, well, let's do a quick Zoom poll here. So just wanted to get a sense, prior to the webinar, how familiar were you with psychological first aid? Especially now that you've kind of had a short introduction to it, that might give you a sense for what it really is compared to some of these other available interventions. So if you could take a minute just to click on the poll, not at all familiar through extremely familiar. Again, this is your level of familiarity prior to the webinar.
And Erin, most people have entered. You guys are fast on the click today.
No, that's good. I actually can't see it. So
I will end polling and that should bring it up.
there it is. All right, so it looks like, I can't tell exactly what you all can see, but it looks like most people were not at all familiar, but some extremely. So again, a good mix here, and I hope we can further get this information out to you all in ways that are useful. Thank you.
It looks about 80% were either not at all familiar or slightly familiar. So if you're interested in this concept, we're very excited to, we'll begin an echo telementoring session for those that are interested, both with the ongoing pandemic as well as with, as we enter the spring natural disaster season, unfortunately.
Exactly.
Great, thank you. And so as Erin was talking about psychological first aid, let's transition a bit now to talking about skills for psychological recovery, which I'll kind of introduce to you all just so you're familiar with this as well, which we'll also be doing an echo telementoring series on soon as well. But just to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of how skills for psychological recovery as a model is different from psychological first aid. Again, PFA, so psychological first aid, as Erin was talking about, is what we would think of as kind of a primary prevention effort, right? We're really trying to get in quickly as soon as we can to just help create conditions for recovery, link folks to additional resources, and kind of, introduce ourselves, help establish good connections with families in the aftermath of a trauma or disaster, so that folks are supported, connected, and sort of have some of the immediate things that they need to begin the process of naturally healing from trauma or disasters, right? So that's something that we can do with anyone, something that we typically do in maybe 1 or 2 contacts, right? So PFA is a really brief, targeted sort of intervention in that way. Skills for psychological recovery is a little more intensive. You can kind of think of this as, I've kind of explained it to people before, as kind of like psychological first aid on steroids. I mean, it's sort of the same idea, but it's just a little more intensive, right? Here we're talking about doing 3 to 5 sessions. So there's generally a little more contact, a little more follow-up. And this is going to be more appropriate for folks who are continuing, again, to just kind of endorse a lot of emotional distress, or just are sort of saying that there are, other concerns that they have, or there are other ways that their life continues to be negatively impacted by the trauma or the disaster, right? So these are going to be the kinds of folks that are probably going to be most likely to benefit from skills for psychological recovery. So what is skills for psychological recovery? Well, again, just like with PFA, just like with psychological first aid, this is an intervention that was also developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the National Center for PTSD. And so it's a modular intervention. So much like psychological first aid, it includes several different kinds of cognitive and behavioral types of skills that we can teach folks, mostly to kind of help them address some ongoing concerns related to those that we talked about earlier when we talked about short-term challenges that can come up following trauma and disasters. So this is really going to be a model, again, that's appropriate for folks with continuing distress. And so we just try to figure out, first, what are the biggest concerns that you have related to what you've gone through? And then from there, we can kind of, gather some information about what their most pressing needs and concerns are. And then we can target sort of, specifically what kind of skills we think would help address those particular concerns. The link that's included here on this slide as well is a link that will take you to the National Center for PTSD's website, where you can download this manual for free. So just like with psychological first aid, the manual is free to all of you. There's some great handouts and resources in the manual. I encourage you to check out if you're interested. And so you can also complete the SPR training on the NCTSN National Child Traumatic Stress Network website, just like with PFA, and it is also free. So I would encourage folks, take a look if you're interested. It's a great resource. So if we can skip to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of sort of what kind of skills are specifically included in the Skills for Psychological Recovery protocol. So again, the very first thing that we do with Skills for Psychological Recovery is really kind of one of the same things that we do with psychological first aid. We sit down and we just try to gather information about all the different ways that your life has been affected by what you've gone through. So with Skills for Psychological Recovery, if I sit down with someone and I'm talking to a family or an adult or someone else who's gone through a trauma or a disaster, I might ask about physical health concerns. Are you able to get access to your medications? Are you able to get access to medical care if needed, right, for ongoing follow-up care and support? So I might ask about that. I'll ask about emotional distress. What kinds of emotional difficulties have you been having? We'll ask about ongoing concerns related to safety. We'll often ask about things related to interpersonal difficulties, right? Because sometimes just even how we relate to those around us in our families and workplace at school can be negatively affected by trauma and disaster. So we'll ask about those kinds of concerns. We'll ask about basic necessities. Are you having any trouble paying for food, groceries, getting what you need, transportation, things like that that are going to be relevant to families and kids. And so we'll also just ask about functioning at school overall and some other kinds of things that folks might have concerns about. So once we spend that first contact gathering information about whatever a family's most pressing concerns are, then I'll sit down with them and I'll try to make some recommendations about what kind of skills we think will be most helpful in addressing your specific concerns. So just like with PFA, I really like SPR because it's kind of a, it can be really tailored uniquely to each family and each person's unique needs, right? So some of the specific skills that we'll include are problem solving, right? So one of the modules and one of the skills that we often do with folks is just to walk through the steps of kind of thinking about how to problem solve solutions to some of the challenges that you're having, right? And the thing about SPR that's really nice about Skills for Psychological Recovery is that it breaks all this down into concrete steps that folks often at this point in their recovery find really useful and really beneficial, okay? Now, I can give you some examples of how I've used problem-solving skills with trauma-exposed families, and just kind of, talk about a lot of different examples of that. But I've had families say to me before that just sitting down and trying to brainstorm solutions to things that they felt like they were stuck on was really, really useful, because it's like, I know how to do this, but there's just so much going on that I kind of feel like I've been in a fog and I kind of forgot how. So it's useful just to sit down and have someone go through this with us, right? So by problem solving, what we're really trying to do is think about if you're overwhelmed with a lot of different problems or challenges, or you're really stuck trying to figure out how to resolve one particular issue, we try to think about brainstorming lots of different ways of solving it, what's going to be most likely to get you and your child and your family to where you want to be, and how do we come up with an action plan to begin sort of moving in the direction of the solution that we think is going to be most likely to work. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about problem solving. Managing reactions is a slightly different skill, where here we're talking about giving folks information about the kinds of emotional distress that they or their children might be experiencing, right? Because a lot of times when we survive a trauma, we survive a disaster, we can feel really just overwhelmed and sort of, and it can be really frightening to experience the full range of reactions that we often have. And often we don't really know what those reactions mean or what they are. You might just think you're going crazy, right? So with managing reactions, part of what we do is just try to give folks information to explain some of what you're likely going through and to normalize the experience a bit for folks, but to also help people think about ways to cope with distress or difficult reactions related to the trauma if and when they happen to pop up, right? So if you start thinking about the trauma and you're in, and you're at school, you're sitting in the classroom, for example, what's something that you can do that maybe, nobody else has to even notice that you can do to kind of help calm yourself, right? So that might be something that we work with kids on if we're trying to think about how to manage reactions. With helpful thinking, we're talking about a skill where really we're working with folks who are kind of having a lot of those recurrent kind of ongoing beliefs about how they feel responsible maybe for something that happened or wish that they had done something different. So here we're just trying to help folks kind of think about the events that they've gone through in a helpful way and in a way that helps promote recovery long term. And again, building good social connections, making sure that people have access to all the different supports that they need in their communities, right? Whether we're talking about emotional support that might come from a mental health provider or someone in your school, or whether we're talking about just informational support. Who do I know that I can trust to give me good resources and point me in the right direction? And good instrumental support, right? So just making sure that I have people around who can just help give me some basic resources that I might need if I really am, in a place where I need some of those resources. But the last one that I want to mention here, and then I want to save just a couple of minutes to take questions that folks may have, because I'm also mindful of our time. One last skill here that's part of the SPR protocol that I happen to think is really, really valuable for a lot of different folks, and I kind of want to leave all of you with today, and recommend maybe you try it out with folks that you're working with, try it out with kids, try it out with families. It's something that we just call positive activity scheduling. And I like this one because of its simplicity and its beauty. It's one of those things that I think folks just instinctively kind of, naturally get. When a few years ago, I was at the Medical University of South Carolina, and we conducted a trial where we were looking at psychological first aid combined with skills for psychological recovery. And we trained local law enforcement victim advocates in the Charleston Tri-County area in using this model and using this approach. And so after doing psychological first aid with victims, a lot of the victim advocates would start introducing positive activity scheduling in their follow-up contacts, because it just really resonated a lot with folks, right? And the basic idea here is one that families get too, right? Right now you're probably, that you've been filled up with a lot of really difficult, painful emotions since this trauma or since this disaster happened, right? But when we start doing things that are meaningful to us and things that we enjoy, we start filling ourselves up with those just positive feelings and those hopeful feelings again, right? And the more that we do those things, on average, the better we're going to feel. And so that really resonates with people, right? Here, all we're talking about is think of something that you or your family can do, right? Maybe even if it's just starting off small, one thing that you or your family can do this week, right? To help yourself feel a little bit better. What's something that you would enjoy that maybe you haven't done since this trauma happened, or maybe this disaster happened, right? So helping people sort of brainstorm ways around that and figure out activities that they might like to do. And often we'll encourage people to do a couple of different activities during the first week or so for homework when we go over this kind of module with people. One thing that you would enjoy doing by yourself, and one thing that you'd enjoy doing with your parents or your siblings or someone else, with like a friend, right? So one solitary fun thing, one thing that you enjoy doing with other people. Now, why do you think that's the case? Does anybody have any idea why we would encourage both of those things? Do something fun that's alone and something fun with another person. Yeah, we do need quietness, right? We've got to have a little bit of that time just to kind of regroup for ourselves. So absolutely. I think it does. Yeah, peace of mind and centering. Absolutely. So I agree with all of those. And yeah, self-care, right? Especially for those things that we're doing alone. Another reason too that we'll encourage kids, families, and adults, regardless if we're working in a family, you know, as a family group or just with a single adult, it's often helpful too to encourage people, in addition to doing those things that you do alone to help ground yourself, to do things with others as well, because sometimes, especially if you're having trouble kind of getting out and doing those things that are important and meaningful to you after a trauma happens, having somebody else around to keep you kind of accountable makes it more likely that we actually start to do those things again and begin to start taking the steps towards rebuilding a path to resilience. And so I want to end with that because we started by talking about resilience today and ways that we can sort of change and change for the better. And I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in the next few weeks when we start talking about PFA and SPR much more in depth, because we'll start thinking about what role each of us can play and how we implement these skills. And so I appreciate everyone being part of the webinar this morning, and I'll turn it back over to the rest of the team. So thank you.
Well, we want to thank everyone for participating today. If you have colleagues, there is another session tomorrow at noon. And we will also send out all the materials from today, the resources, and we'll link the chat. And we hope to have the recording up, and we'll send that out as well. I hope everyone has a great day. I hope everyone learned and found something valuable that they can use in their work from today's session. And we'll be following up with everyone about further sessions related to these topics. So have a great day.
Hope to see you soon.